already almost a couple of years since he gave a talk here at the school. The thing that is, or one of the things that's great about Will is that he's, in a sense, very much an unconventional architect. I think that many architects, once they become successful, once they become established in a way, they tend to have a kind of one-track mind, and they focus very much on what they're doing and the office in a way. And I think what has contributed to Will's success and I think his significance is precisely his kind of deviations in some way. It's very difficult to find people once they have the office who would then also make a major contribution, for example, to teaching. And I think that from the very beginning, Will has always combined his interest in architectural practice with his teaching. When he had first left the AA, he was very much involved in the sculpture department at Central St. Martin's, and one used to see him. He's now has a number of professorships, including his position at the Technical University in Vienna. And I think this involvement with what is going on with students, with young people, is very much an important part of what he does. I think the other thing that has always been there from the beginning is his relationship to contemporary art. Many architects, again, deal with art as a kind of added, as a sort of supplement, as a kind of added component to their work. I think with Will Alsop, again, he's practiced as an artist for a long time, and I think his paintings are really wonderful in their own right. But there has, of course, come many points where there is more and more of an overlap between the way in which he begins his paintings, the sources of this work, and then the architectural practice and the architectural projects. And I think that again is somehow makes the approach to the work much more unusual than the work of many people. It's really great that after many years of building primarily in Europe, now there are lots of opportunities for him to be doing projects here in the UK. And at the moment he runs 3 practices out of Moscow, Hamburg, and London. And I believe he's the only non-Russian to have received the gold medal for architecture, which is a great thing, and was the recipient of the OBE in the last year's honors list. Would you please join me in welcoming Will Alsop? Thank you.
I think we should stop there, actually. I quite like that. Thank you very much. It is 2 years, exactly, almost to the day, last time I was here. I still find it strange to stand here, because in September 1968, I was sitting there. And I enjoyed being a student here. I enjoyed learning. And I think that although that spirit of the AA wavered a little bit in more recent years, now it seems to be coming up again, and the AA is becoming more interesting, and the sort of place that I might then recommend my own son to go to, even though he's studying somewhere else. His choice, not mine. Can't find my notes. Ah, yes, here we go. It's very hot in here. The issue of working in London, which is like a foreign place to me, to a certain extent, although I always have lived in London, and I like London, I enjoy London, I rather love it, really. It is, however, a relatively new experience for me. And you have to say, why is that? And I don't know if any of you read the Daily Telegraph. There's no reason why you should read the Daily Telegraph, but some of you do, I'm sure. And yesterday, you see the headline, something, I can't remember the exact headline, Christoph, you might remember exactly, but it said something like, oh, at last he's able to build, or this unbuildable project. I mean, and this is the headline, which is precisely not very useful, of course, because you can build anything you like. And I think that's one of the things that characterizes this very special period in architecture, which I think we're well into, and it will develop further, that actually there are no particular rules. And the fact that, particularly here in London, you will find that there is a generation of architects and architectural practices who actually believe in rules. And if they don't find the rules, they invent the rules, which I find extraordinary. I'm talking here about sort of polite modernists. Many of these polite modernists, as I call them, are not very interesting. I don't find them challenging. They're not doing anything in terms of architectural development, which is a challenge in itself. It's all quite nice, difficult to criticize, and 150% better than the majority of stuff that is actually built in the environment. But it doesn't ask any questions. And within the practice, we do try and keep on some sort of edge where we can ask questions, experiment a little bit, confirm things, and to cross a few borders. And that, of course, is why I'm sometimes referred to by the press as being the wild man of British architecture. Do I look wild? Absolutely not. But it does give rise to a certain practice. It also gives rise to a certain suspicion now and again. A certain suspicion that many of those polite modernists have been promoted by people who were inventive and who've done very well from the English architectural scene. It's as though they've been protecting their own significant position within national and international architectural scenes by promoting something that's rather dull, on the other hand. What will the South Bank look like after it's been master planned? What value does master planning have, actually? My experience of master planning is an excuse to make a plan which is then studiously ignored by subsequent events. It's an old thing, isn't it? It seems to me that master planning in itself could well be, should be, the beginnings of the architecture. And there shouldn't be a separate thing called master planning or urban design. It's all the same thing. And you can't take one away without destroying the other. And one is a natural consequence of the other. And do we have an urban design course here? I think we should stop it immediately. And if we don't, it should be done in another way. But anyway, this is a debate we'll have over supper, perhaps. But I think that's a very important point, that many good opportunities are destroyed by second-rate master planners, who then, sadly, where we do get a good one, then is not allowed to go on and build within the context of the plan that they create. That seems absurd to me. Why not? Who invented that rule? Who invented the idea of reading architecture as though from the outside, as though from a book? That there is this sort of way of reading the character of the architecture through the lines and formation of the external elevation. Who said that was important in today's? I'll tell you later. But in terms of our work, and I think our work is different, although it doesn't seem very different to me, but to the outside world it often does, it comes really from a long history of looking at ways of working in process, and which is something that was particularly developed both in my time as a student here, and then in the time that I spent teaching here in the very early days with people like David Green, where we were fascinated with the idea of how things came about. And we still talk in the bureau, in the office today, about the notion of discovering the architecture. That it's not a preconceived thing. It doesn't come out of a set of rules. It comes out of working at architecture. It's very simple. And then behind that is the idea, or the admiration, for someone like the artist Robert Irwin. I'm sure I've mentioned his name in this room before, but it seemed to me that he did say something that was very important, that art, and by implication architecture, was an agreement, and that agreement is the necessary component of something called compromise. And the compromise, which many of these polite modernists I was talking about see as selling out, actually is extremely important. The compromise is the essence of the world in which we live. And therefore, it's not something to worry about, it's something to indulge in and something to enjoy. Compromise is the essence of who you are. Many of you and me, we're compromises anyway, in the way that we're brought up. So compromise is a positive word. It signifies agreement. It means that things are allowed to exist. And this was also a component of the teaching in St. Martin's, which Moyson referred to. And you can see it, I think, in the works of Morris and Judd, and even in Swansea, all of whose influences I've found in our work. But particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, we've tried, partly through opportunity, of course, which has always helped, to deal with this idea of public consultation. Of course, which is always a problem. If you think of the idea of community architect, if I say community architect, you immediately think, I don't want to be a community architect. They do those funny things. You know, they convert 60s blocks of flats and put pitched roofs on them and give rather gay colours and hope that everyone has a better time in them. It's not the sort of thing you want to do at all. But actually, the true notion of being a community architect is very interesting, because it embodies within it all those things that Robert Irwin is saying about the notion of agreement and compromise. And of course, you can then turn this around and say, well, that is the essence and a very important component of this thing of discovering architecture. So there's no precondition for any architecture to exist. There's only a situation in which you have to unearth and then discover. And that's, from that discovery, you surprise yourself as well as your client, or the people that are going to use it, or however that client is composed. Very important. And therefore, I do tonight actually declare ourselves as community architects. And that's what we intend to be, and that's what we'll intend to do. And I have two projectors. I'll only talk to one set of slides, because there are just 2 projects where I want to actually show and try and explain how we might approach this idea of community architecture in order to get the best out of the subject, in order to get the best building, not only for us, but for the people that actually live within that community. The other set of slides is really just a reminder of other work that we've done, which I may or may not refer to. And it's there because some of it conforms to what I'm saying, and some of it doesn't. I could regard it in our new role as community architects a failure. Not a nice failure very often, but a failure nonetheless. Insofar that it was preconceived, too much design, the idea of worrying about door handles. There's sort of toughness. There's a toughness within the idea of community architecture which is very useful. Nothing to do with budgets. Budgets are always low in my experience. So perhaps we could have the lights down and the slides on. And the building on the right, and if I walk over here you can still hear me all right. Okay. This is not community architecture, although it's a failed proposal for something for the community. But the first project I want to talk about is situated in West Bromwich, and it's a community art centre, and it's, wrong way round. There's West Brom, there's central Birmingham, sort of. There's the M5, M42, their version of the M25. And Birmingham in itself is a very interesting place because it's a sort of hidden secret. And if you really want to annoy someone from Berlin, you can say that our second city has a bigger population than their first city. It's a very useful tip. You know, if they're annoying you over supper or something, you can sort of bring out these facts. And you can also guarantee that they've never been to Birmingham, and you wonder why. Marvelous. They've stolen the leader of the symphony orchestra in Berlin without even going there. They didn't go and listen to him, they just liked his hairstyle. But anyway, there's West Brom, but actually there's a sort of hidden boundary in here. So this is the Black Country, and Birmingham isn't. And West Bromwich, of course, was bombed heavily in the war, and it sort of comes from a place where, and I'm old enough to remember that if something that you bought in a shop, a particular toy when I was small, if it was made in Birmingham, this was a cheap toy. Because it was all made in backyards, very often in this sort of area. And there was steel, there was energy. Of course, you have to remember that Birmingham didn't really exist 250 years ago beyond being a village of 300 or 400 people. Then it grew rapidly with the Industrial Revolution. And then it got bombed. And that was the end of that. And it never really got repaired in some ways. Although there is, in West Brom, there's a street called the Golden Mile. It's the Golden Mile of shopping and sort of disporting oneself on the street and going and seeing and meeting and greeting and all those things. And of course, if you go there today, you couldn't see, you can just see some vestiges of the remainder of that particular thing. But we're very happy to work in this area. And people in the Black Country, many of which, have never been to downtown Birmingham, even though they're connected with the metro, which is about 20-25 minutes away from the centre of Birmingham. They haven't been because they're very proud. Birmingham is somewhere else. So we're dealing with a group of very proud people who have great admiration and actually perhaps for the first time have realised that the centre of West Bromwich as it stands today is complete shit. It's important to know and to recognise that in order to do something about it. And they are beginning to think about it and do something about it. And that's where our project comes in. Our project is called Cplex, and it's for a group called Jubilee Arts, who have been operating as a community arts group within West Bromwich and beyond, with 1 or 2 international commissions for 25 years. I think that's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary group. So far there's energy there. And community arts is a bit like community architecture. You think it's a bit of a turn-off. But actually, perhaps this is the way that art might go. And many of the artists that are working with Jubilee and in the future Cplex are artists that you would find would be perfectly at home in the Tate. Therefore, it's not a question of making a division between this is the type of artist that is a community artist and this is the type of artist that is ready for the Tate. There's no distinction like that. In the same way that there is no distinction behind where their money comes from. In the work that they do with the health authority, the prison, with the education authority, it's a totally integrated attitude towards their role as having an art centre within West Bromwich. Next slide, please. The question is where to start with it. There had been, and this is an Arts Council project I had to add, but there had been some other architects doing a feasibility study who had located the building in this sort of area here. It took us a very long time to actually get this job. Something like 4 months of interviews before we got it, and then we had 4 months to do a stage D. 4 months to be appointed, 4 months to get to a stage D in terms of proposition. And within that 4 months, we'd already said that we couldn't actually take on the project of saying what it is, discovering what this thing might be, unless we could actually do a master plan for the town. Perhaps not the master plan that they were mentioning, but we needed some way to root this project within the town, an idea of the town. And West Bromwich is not a town that we know. We knew it a little bit, but not very well. This is the Golden Mile. This we invented as the Silver Kilometre. The centre of the town at the moment is there, and it's characterised by a zebra crossing where people frequently get killed. It's a friendly sort of place. There's an expressway that runs down here, which is actually in a cutting. So as you can sail past downtown West Brom, and you wouldn't know it was there. Over here somewhere is the M5, and up there is the M6. And you could see, and in fact you can see, there's a church on this corner here. You can see the centre of West Bromwich, but you wouldn't know, because it's seamless. It's urbanism just stretched out over the rolling hills. We thought that in the 60s, some very well-intentioned people built this ring road here, and then put a 60s shopping precinct in the middle of it, took the traffic out of that, and that fucked everything. But of course, they did it for good reason. I mean, that was fashionable at the time. One must always beware of fashion, of one city copying another city, and that's what they were doing here, of course. They were copying things that were happening in other towns in Britain, and that was what you had. You had a pedestrian precinct with shopping, and you kept the traffic on the edge of that, with parking all the way around. That's out of date concept. But we equally had to be careful that you don't replace one out-of-date concept with another concept that goes out of date in the same period of time. So I think it's more readily understood, the idea of evolution these days, the evolution of a city as opposed to a concept. And that's clearly this idea of fashion, design, rules, all mitigates against making the right decision, in my view. So we say we have no rules, we're highly unfashionable, therefore we won't have this problem. So the first thing we had to do within this 4-month period was to move the site from there to there, which meant you had to understand the fact that there is here an existing bus station, which is going to move here to this poppy. So there's a metro station here, which is already functioning. That actually there's some crap buildings here, which could disappear, but not at the moment. And perhaps we could have the old bus station site, which puts the community arts centre right in the heart of the city, becomes the instrument of regeneration. I suppose I should also add that there will be a 24-hour Tesco somewhere here. Very important. We went through a lot of exercises about could you graft it, or should you graft it onto the Tesco? Should you extend the shopping aisles straight with your trolley through, baked beans, bit of art? Could be very good. What art? I sort of regret that we didn't do that anyway. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the sort of place it is. B&Q, which will disappear. Police station behind, existing bus station. This is not the famous zebra crossing, but this is yet another one. Gives you an idea. Next. So the existing situation is like that, and we're saying that the cross is more useful because it can extend slightly. And of course there are many other points about this cross, but if you go in this direction, there's a very beautiful park here, a really beautiful park, which you can't get to. And clearly within our master plan we're saying there should be a beautiful lily pad as a sort of bridge which takes you seamlessly from Seaflex about there through to the park to make those connections. Maybe they will happen, maybe they won't. But it's about establishing some sort of context. Have the next, please. What interested me was the way in which to work, and this is one of a number of workshops with different groups of people. By this time we had a complete team of people, quantity surveyors, structural engineers, this one sitting here in fact, Meet Kara, very important that the whole of the building team sits in the sessions to discover what this thing is, or what it could be. They contribute both specialist knowledge and knowledge as ordinary people. Hanif is sort of an ordinary person with specialist knowledge. We all are. And that's very important. And all these people here actually work within the CPLEX Jubilee organisation. And there are many more of them, of course. And we did also workshops with school children about imagining what the centre of West Brom might be, and so forth. But always, in this particular one, actually it wasn't this workshop, it was another one, it was about getting people to draw themselves, to write and describe what they think CPLEX is. And of course we had the great advantage that, in fact, no one knows what a community arts centre is. You can't. If I asked all of you to write down what a community arts centre is, I'd have 200 different answers, which is a great advantage, and that's the way it should be. That's healthy. And then you ask people to draw these things, and then you interpret those drawings, and you find that no one ever actually talks about the building as a whole, because it's impossible, but they talk about bits of the building. And then you can assemble these bits. There's a sort of disarticulation, which is a difficult word, because it doesn't exist. But you take it down to bite-sized chunks, bits of understanding. Good ideas, bad ideas, possible ideas, the odd thought here, etc., etc. Perfect. Next. Actually, at the end of one of the, well, this isn't a very good example because I've manipulated it, but we did start off with the idea of the table in the workshop, where I draw a big table, like a very standard table, size of the screen, and as people report back on their discoveries and their thoughts and things that are important to them, you then ask them where it should go. It should be on the table, sensible part, like laying the table. It should be under the table, naughty bit. It should be by the table, not belonging to either of those two worlds. And the table as a sort of metaphor is always something that's sort of interested us. Insofar that in polite circles you can call it the plane of social discourse, which it is. Many things in life happen at tables. And then you can change and redress the table. So your breakfast table looks completely different to a table when you're inviting someone on a special one. But it's the same thing. You know. Could you make a building that can respond in that as readily as your dining table at home? And then you do a bit of work on the table from time to time. You read the newspaper and you dream, you get drunk. I mean, there's all sorts of things that happen within actually a very small space. Of course, in many houses, and I'm sure that my house is no different to anyone, you sometimes think why you have the house. Because in actual fact, you're always sitting at the table. You just need a bed, which is one horizontal plane, and a table, which is another horizontal plane. That was extraordinary, isn't it? Why have I got a library? Never read. Reading sends you blind, of course. But that's another story. So one begins to develop these sketches and thoughts, what it could be. The next. And in line with most of our experience, when you start to imagine it, it always gets bigger than it should be. So that's right, you don't have to worry about that. You have to run with it. You say, well, if you set up the notion of the table, which seemed to be very acceptable, with strange things laying on it, then, didn't they say that they were interested in a new library? Well, that could plug in. And actually, in the end, you sort of end up with this long thing going right through that. And before you know it, you've designed in a single building the whole of the town. Should be wonderful. But on the other hand, not possible. But sometimes it's important to expand everything in order to contract. So you've covered, by implication, I think the politicians, the people that live there, you've covered all their aspirations, because what you find is many of their aspirations have nothing to do with the community arts centre at all. They're to do with other things in the town, or deficiencies in the town. So So you can begin to construct some sort of skeleton in which they can attach all their aspirations into it, and our aspirations as well. Oh, next slide. It's a rather awkward thing here, really, but could be quite interesting. And Eve got quite excited about it. Thought that we were really going to do it. Marvellous structural opportunity. I can tell you now, we never intended to do this, honey. We'd never have done that, ever. But, exercise your brain for me. 200-metre span, no legs. Actually, this is quite interesting as an aside, that as one sort of developed this notion of drawing or painting or sketching or making models, I've noticed that we've gone further and further away from structure. We don't draw in legs, you see, which is marvellous for Hanif or other engineers that we're working with, because they always ask the question, how does this stay up? You say, well, you can do anything you like, but please, no columns. And we haven't found an engineer yet that can deliver that. The conclusion you might draw is there are no good engineers in Britain. Have the next slide, please. There's all times that you're developing the drawing, going back, presenting things, having discussions, the workshops. What did the children do? And talking with the doctors. Doctors and artists are the two most conservative types that you can find when it comes to architecture. But it doesn't matter. But in the end, of course, they all take ownership of what you're doing. They're absolutely rather extraordinary. Because they all feel, oh, look, that was my that's the person there. That was my idea. They don't look at the rest of it, they just look at their idea, and it's included. And sometimes it's a very good idea. And what you find is that many of their ideas are better than your ideas, or many of their understandings are deeper and more deeply felt than your understandings, because they've lived there all their lives and you haven't. So you've got to the stage where you've still got the tabletop, got some sort of cover, some idea of a street at high level, and then various events and things at low level. And then here's the ground. The next, please. And then you begin to sort of struggle with a few other ideas, and some ideas from the past. You're always one's fascinated with freight containers, aren't you? Maybe not. And moving things around within the context. And of course, we have a tabletop. The underside of the table is like a fly tower without walls around it, or it can be used in this sort of way, and you can move things around. And there's a notion of parts of the building that can stretch out and into and affect and work with the environment around this particular building. Next. We begin to develop various notions where suddenly this building is in the middle of a new town square. And therefore, should the town square extend all the way under this table? Should this be free space, which is then programmed by the artists? And here we're saying that the work that they do actually leans heavily on new technologies and communication. Therefore, it is both local and global in its aspirations. And that, I'm 100% sure, will be the case. Next, please. Ah, yes, that one's stuck this afternoon. Have the next. Oh, you've done it. No? Ah, yes. So as we sort of verge towards this stage D, held up with this box with a shroud, two squares, one on top and one underneath. It's a square with various TV screens under it. Be looked at from above, can be explored. It is always open, of course. Bits of the building that can open up on the side. This shroud that goes around the building, which we're exploring fiber optic fabric so you can introduce colour and images into it. Rather interesting in a way. The next. And then the height from the ground floor to the underside, yes, this stage was 15 meters, I think. It's good. We know that if you're putting something above space, it can't be less than 11 or 11.5 meters. If it's below that, you feel as though you're standing under a building. If it's above, if it's at that height or more, you're not standing under a building. You're standing in an intended space, which can then be consequently programmed. And then inside, there is a requirement inevitably for offices, for meeting rooms, for workshops, and all of those things that they do with the community to suck them in. And they all enter through this sock, public space, and that actually it's not on this particular drawing, but the sock also has a funicular railway that runs up through, so instead of a lift, you enter a funicular and it becomes an event within itself. What our client was looking for here was something that Jubilee Arts could continue their community work with, combined with Cplex, which is effectively a sort of cultural version of Alton Towers or Disneyland, but done completely by artists, of course. Very interesting. You know, that we all know from the very early days of something like Bridget Riley, there are lots of people that went to see Bridget Riley exhibitions, because not because of the show, because it was sort of strange to see things moving around in front of you. It was an illusion that you enjoy. Of course, with the sophistication of new technologies, of course, you can do all sorts of things. You can play with your own self-image, which is something they're very interested in at Cplex. You can communicate. You can work with other people, and so on and so forth. So this will satisfy all those aspirations with sort of both an overriding concern with health, education, and lifelong learning. So it's fully integrated within the community. Next slide, please. And the next. So we arrived at this stage B, and here it is. I just wanted to show you pictures of this. Next. Space which is private but programmable. A box which does magic things. And another space which is always public, which is also programmable. Next, please. Same thing at night. You can see the height that this is beginning to come compared with the church, which is the most dynamic thing that you can see on the horizon at the moment from the two motorways. The next. And you have to look at this in the way that this square here will extend when this building goes in the near future. So it occupies potentially a very long public square, which ultimately would lead you then back through to the public park on the other side of the expressway. Next. For me. And then various events under the building to help create this. So what we're creating here is that if West Bromwich Albion ever won the FA Cup, I did say if, this is where people would naturally gather. Could be a long wait, really. Next. Then we put all that to one side and start it again. In this way. So a whole series of work over this last summer that we entered into, which we called a series of notions, not options. Many architects, I've noticed, and Norman Foster is one of them, they always talk about options, you know. And options is a very difficult word in our vocabulary, because options means that, or it's taken that you've got the ability to choose from this, this, or this. And we don't mean that, you know, because there's always all the other things. So a notion is part of a possible never-ending progression of things that you could do. But in this particular case, it was necessary, having guided and worked with and discovered one possibility, to then return and go through the search again, to reopen it, to see what other possibilities might exist. also, the whole group by this time, because everyone's an architect, is then beginning to think, well, if we'd had more time, we could have done this. Or now the accountants in the group think, well, if we did it another way, we might actually secure a greater sort of revenue stream. And all of these things become sort of doubts, quite right for them. And we're always very happy to change things. I like to change things, much to the annoyance of some people. And therefore the opportunity to work through the summer on the beach on a series of notions is very important. Here's one where you can begin to see that the components of this, of the C-plex itself, that the experience comes in the middle, there's sort of office components up here, public space, and so on and so forth. How could we reconfigure it now that we knew exactly where the site was? Because we didn't know when we started. And the next. And the next. Should we put the main body of it inside the ground, underground, with various elements coming up like players within the context of this public square? Because all of these notions as we developed them were then debated on another round of workshops and discussions. Next. The only person that we omitted from that was the quantity surveyor. Because cost was not an issue at this stage. It's a question of, is there a better direction? Is there a more positive element related to the architecture that we can begin to develop? And that's wholly appropriate. And you don't want to be put off with the question, can we afford it? You had to work from the basis, you can always afford it. Next. Could the building actually be a sort of huge, distorted wooden shed? 40 meters, therefore. It seems interesting, wouldn't it? I thought so. Next. Which then developed in the sketch model. The whole of the accommodation became a double helix. So one route was always public, and from which you could then enter into various delights, which were then suspended from the fly tower, remember the table, in the middle of the building. And then the intervening helix was actually for all the other work that CPLEX and Jubilee do, in terms of meeting rooms, workshops, administration, all of those things, so that everything is separated but always on show. And from this, of course, it begins to emerge, and the nature of the conversation begins to come, where you begin to see that actually it's all, the whole thing is the public experience. You can't say this is office and this is public, this is art experience, that it's all experience, because it all has the capability of changing, particularly because of new technology. The next. And the next. Didn't like that one. Next. See how strong the table comes out all the time. And the next. This became sort of the object and the cloud of silver space, but very strongly related to the first design that we had. And the next. And the next. Should this be one volume? Should all this be concrete here? Could you make a building which actually is not a building, it is only an artwork? That would be an interesting thing to do, wouldn't it? Could you do that? It would change the nature of the planning application. We're not applying permission to build a building, only to place an artwork. Could it be that way? I mean, at what point does a building cease to be a building? I mean, I don't know the answer to this. It's a rhetorical question. But here you have the volume and the fly tower, the open fly tower, and various events coming in as a result of that. Next. Next is the model form. And of course, inevitably, as in every project that you have, there's a place for the stomach. Next. Then into this other round, and we're sort of getting up to where we are more or less now with this project, where merged at the top of the table actually is a street, that when people arrive, they come in, they go in a very large 67-person hydraulic lift, and they find themselves in a conventional street, toying with the idea of calling this the high street, of course. And in this tower here is managed workspace. These are new small businesses, which then have a strong relationship with the work that CFlex is doing down here. And you go into a shop. These little sweeties along here are basically shops. You might get a cup of coffee, you might buy a vase of flowers, you might have your hair done, it might be a tattoo shop, it might be a bookshop. Some of you might be old enough to remember The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And while you're in this bookshop, you want to open this book, and the shelf opens and allows you into the underworld underneath the thing, which then allows you to explore all this other stuff which is being programmed by artists, some of which changes daily, some which is there for much longer periods of time. So there's always some point in going here. And actually in the latest development of this project, we're in negotiation at the moment with the local health authority to put a primary healthcare unit into this position here, and put these people up there. It's very interesting because the primary healthcare unit has 250,000 sick people a year going to it. On January the 8th, if that's a Monday morning, it's cold and it's wet, you want people in this building at 9 o'clock in the morning. They wouldn't be. Thank God for the sick. But of course, there's a natural relationship, because remember that this lot work with the health authority. And what they found in experience is that some people that might, or perhaps even should, have gone to the doctor, will come and talk to someone in this organisation. Therefore, there's a natural overlap. So this breakdown of boundaries between disciplines and services offered to the community is a very important aspect of this whole project. Next, please. And the next. And in fact, we've had one meeting today, most of the day, evolving this particular solution, and I think that we're virtually there now. In terms of, but it's in total time, it's more or less taken a year and a quarter to go from being awarded the project to getting to the beginnings of a stage C, in our IBA terms, where you've explored all these options. Quite rightly, lots of discussion. What I can tell you is that 12 months ago, we could never have designed or thought about anyone, whether part of the community or ourselves, this. It's extraordinary. So that's what I mean by the idea of discovering architecture. And you would not be able to produce this by applying any architectural rules that I know about how architecture should be, about how architecture should be well-mannered, about issues of context, issues of style. They don't apply. They're not even conversations. What we're focused on is what is right and how do they operate within this place, this point on the Earth's surface. How is that? And as a result of that, you discover this other stuff. The next piece. And the next. Second project in Rotterdam, which I'll be very quick about because I've taken a long time on the first one, is here. Those of you who know Rotterdam, those of you who don't know Rotterdam well, is you know the sort of centre of activity is really based around here. It's rather nice. This is the new bridge, rather
good hotel here, the New York Hotel. Bit of Norman Foster here, bit of Renzo piano there. There's a whole sort of architectural zoo emerging in that particular spot. And there's a metro line that runs through here. And if you analyse that metro line, there's a cinema or a place of public importance all the way down that line. And there's a metro stop here, and there's nothing. There's an empty building, which is an old, well, it's not empty, it is actually being used, but it's a big silo.
And the question that is posed is, what can we do with this silo? And the silo, of course, is constructed of concrete. It's a brick shithouse, lots of long tubes, designed to take impacts from explosions, internal explosions, so it's very strong. Cut holes in these concrete tubes. It's very difficult because the concrete is so strong, and therefore it's very difficult to know what to do with it. But I think so should this building stay, or should it go? It's actually a listed building, but of course the Dutch, being ever practical, say if we can't find a use for it, we'll knock it down anyway. Jocelyn Stevens should take a few lessons from them. Of course, the idea, of course, is to bring this part of Rotterdam into the concept of the centre of Rotterdam. Not a concept that's unfamiliar to London, and you look at it or read about all those things happening at Elephant and Castle. The whole idea is to bring Elephant and Castle perception, in terms of people's perception, into the idea of central London. Because Elephant and Castle could be central London. Difficult to imagine, but it could be. Geographically, it's in the right place, and it's quite well connected. But that's another story, which is for the next 2 years. And the next slide, please. So there's the metro line. Here's the building. Here's an old dock. Defunct stuff most of the way down. So it's not about just looking at this building, but it's a question of looking at this edge and looking at this stretch of water. What interests me is it is a very difficult building. And what, can I have the next slide, please? Here's a plan of it. All of these are concrete. Story. Built in phases. What interests me is, or coming out of looking at this, is the idea or the appropriateness of designing the impossible building. To actually create an opportunity, albeit in this case from an existing building, which is usable, but you could not give it to, I couldn't give the eventual plan to any of you to put labels on it, because you wouldn't know what label to put on it. Labeling architecture is the enemy of architecture, of course, because once you say something is a bedroom, people perceive it as a bedroom, not as a possible space to do anything else. But you can do whatever you like, wherever you like. And there are rules concerning that. And once you go into the public realm, why not in such a building as this? What you do know is you could never afford to build this building again, because there's no reason for it. And I think that's also interesting. So being a sort of conservationist as well as a community architect, one has to sort of develop these new roles in life. As it comes with age, you know. The next. Like a section through a part of the building. From ground level up to here is 53 meters. But you'll notice that all this concrete stops at this level. So there is sort of vaguely clear space, full of a lot of columns, but you can walk through this space at dockside level. Next. You begin to look at this building, this form of building. What can you do with it? Well, it is tall, and you can see it from a lot of other parts of the city. So you can do something with the front. There are no windows in it. You can do something with the bottom. You could do something with the top. Let me continue. Next. Maybe the front should become a big blackboard. No, it's a socially useful function. Maybe not. Next. Then working with
Bruce McLean, talking, exploring things, you know, writing things about this idea of the impossible building. You know, it's a building beyond function. What happens if you do that? You develop simply as a piece of machinery or a series of spaces, difficult spaces. What happens if you do that and then just put one label on it, which is opera house? You don't mean, it could mean literally opera, but you could say that even when the building's not being used, it is opera. The experience of walking through it is opera. That would be interesting. What would happen if you then put a group like Jubilee Arts and Seaplex and say, well, here you are, here is this building, what would you do with it? It's a wonderful opportunity. There are thousands of people in the world that don't need an excuse, or indeed an architect perhaps, to look at this existing building and say, what is it? Don't need that. I think that's very interesting. Of course, when you start to think about these things, if this is the existing building here, then you always find it's not big enough. You have to extend it. What happens if you put a hypermarket, single story, the biggest hypermarket in Rotterdam, adjacent to a difficult building? What happens if there's an existing building here, that becomes a school, and what would the nature of that school be? And supposing this is an extraordinary car park here, supposing you walk along the roof and enter into this. Remember these stripes that go up and down, these tubes. You look down equally, you can look up, isn't it? Next. I don't understand that. Down in the basement, hypermarket, tubes, operatic elements coming down from the tubes, Rake's Progress in motion here, just sex over here, and yeah, it's a rather extraordinary place, isn't it?
Could you make this building just by taking things away, in other words, or by making it publicly accessible, and then just simply finding a group like Jubilee or Seaplex, say, this is yours. Oh, there's a bit of a budget, of course. Next. That was a difficult one to do. I was trying to draw the view on the roof, but it didn't work. Next. What was interesting in this, which became significant, this is a sort of notional section through the water, which is 8 meters deep, back to the building, which is here. There's giraffes and polar bears and things. I was interested by a sort of accident and a quirk of fate, as you sort of spilt some paint over it. This idea of whether you can make things which look two-dimensional on a drawing and actually occupy space within reality. Of course, if you do something that's a complete building with no particular function, or a difficult building, or the impossible building, you can do anything you like. Of course. That's extraordinary. Would that be a contribution to the sort of urban recognition of what this part of Rotterdam could be? Would it help? What would it do? These are questions that we have to ask and maybe answer. It's not always necessary to answer the question. Next. And the next. This is another Dutch project over here in New Town Centre in Almere. So that's for 2 years' time. Then you start to spread out of the building into the water. What can you do with the water? Next. I think this is very dull. Next. Next. Again, you had to put labels on because the politicians who are part of your client, they expect labels. But we haven't finished this program. We're in sort of mid-thought, mid-thinking about this. The next. And the next. This painting here is 4 meters by 3 meters, and this is Menorca. This is
working with Bruce, and here is the silo. Again, taking these thoughts to another country, which is always interesting. A different type of alcohol, and useful. Early morning work and late night work. Next. Begin to talk about the idea of the roof, the idea of taking things out, things that pass through the building, things that never-present morning sunrise here. Next. The square cow. It's important to think about these things. Next. The whole point of working on this sort of scale is that you can actually, there's the building. Allows you to think about the water in other ways. It allows you to, you physically have to use a ladder to get to the top of it. It's not easy to do. It's not the architect's sort of sketchette on the back of an envelope. This is the big sketch where you have to use the whole of your body. You have to walk around. And you can get sort of perspectives on your two-dimensional frame. There is an advantage to working at a larger scale. There's an advantage in this particular case of working with my old friend, collaborator Bruce, who's been a great contributor to this project. It's difficult. Sometimes he's in a terribly bad mood. I never get in bad moods. You have to cheer him up. The only way of cheering Bruce up is to make a bit of a sort of wonderful mark, Yes. Bruce, not his underpants, they're swimming trunks. And moving past, but if you're creating something rather wonderful here, on the other side of the key, perhaps it's important to actually have a very slow way of moving along this side. Now the program, you see, of course, is some very dull housing. Unbelievably dull. The sort of place that you think, I would never like to live in. The sort of project that as architects you might all accept, which I find curious. Never like to live in this, but I will accept the commission because it's got a good fee. It's odd, isn't it? So clearly, that building there, Sano, has the opportunity to affect this horrible housing that's going to come down here. And I must say that, by and large, the Dutch, for some peculiar reason, have a wonderful reputation for producing housing. I keep looking at this housing. The more I go to Holland, I keep looking at it, and I can't understand why they have this reputation, because it looks, it's going to fall apart anyway, and you say nothing else. Very badly put together. Deathly dull. Not where it should be. It's where you don't want it to be. It's a very sort of strange decision, I always find. And yet, written up in pages of our esteemed journals in this country, why can't we be more like Holland? I think this would be a great mistake, actually. Dutch for the Dutch, I say. It's terrible. I mean, I accept they have a problem with rather beautiful inner city areas, which they don't want to destroy by loading them up with things, but that's the question. Perhaps they should bring the historical areas into the 21st century. Perhaps they should wipe away some of that esteemed history. Perhaps they should become more, they're the ones who are talking about being condensed all the time, and they're the ones that keep building on actually rather beautiful landscape. I find the Dutch landscape extraordinary. Its flatness, the significance of a single tree. And then suddenly there's a great rash of houses, full of people that wish they didn't live there, as far as I can see. They'd rather live in the middle of Amsterdam or Rotterdam or wherever it is, but no, they're living there. Very peculiar. I mean, the English are no less peculiar, I mean, I have to say, but in a different way. The net. I know, this is the last slide, and there we are, stretching the canvas and working away, both working horizontally and vertically. Clearly, both of these projects tonight are in mid-flow, so to speak. And I would like very much the opportunity, perhaps in a year or two, to come back and show you the results of both of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Will. Your comment about the urban design. We don't have an urban design program,
good.
but we do have this new program on landscape urbanism, which I think it gives me an opportunity to plug that program, because in some ways it sort of tries to, to deal with some of this criticism that you were addressing at the beginning in relation to the idea of the master plan, and somehow it's very much conscious of the relationship between landscape and urbanism in terms of the question of temporality and time. And in a way, I think that kind of leads me to the way that you made the presentation. I mean, if one kind of follows the left-hand side version of the presentation, you know, everything is it's taken a very long time, and the way that you consider things. But of course, on the other hand, one sees on the right-hand side all these other projects you're building, and it's difficult in one sense to reconcile the kind of tempo of the slides on the left-hand side with the sheer number of projects on the right-hand side. But in some ways, what I think my question, if there's the thing that I think is interesting is whether you feel because you also refer to this thing about stage C and stage D, and very much about the way in which architects work and what they have to do at each stage. Whether you feel that the way that you are working in some way already sets up certain problematics in terms of, for example, the way that architects work normally. Somehow your relationship with painting, with taking time, and so on and so forth. Do you feel that certain current structures of practice actually make it difficult in a way for you to have the kind of practice that you have? Because, for example, in the case of the West Bromwich project, it's taken a year and a half or whatever, a year and a quarter to get to where you are, which normally, presumably, this is a very difficult thing to do in terms of the scale of fees, what the clients want, and so on. So how do you reconcile your particular mode of working with the structures of finance, payment, whatever, that are instilled within the profession?
I'm very poor. I think we're doing the way that we work is the right way of working and what one should do. And of course, by and large, if you are paid the something approaching the RIBA recommended rate, you can afford to work in that way. And therefore, it's very clear. You know, if you're going for, if someone's going for cut price fees, then it's very, very, very hard because you really can't afford to do that. But I think that the more important part of your question is really what is the nature of practice and who might actually occupy space within this studio in which you work. And clearly we have architects, but increasingly, and this is a debate that I'm looking at Christoph that we have, maybe there's another range of people that we need, particularly with the introduction of IT, people that understand IT, which is quite handy, but people that can actually manipulate it in other ways. We have a young artist, Tim Thornton, who's working in the practice at the moment. He brings another sensibility. So, and perhaps we need some more graphics-orientated people. It becomes very much more sort of team-orientated in terms of the skills that people bring to it. And therefore what we're finding is that the architects, of course, are extraordinarily multidisciplinary and sort of wonderful sort of universal people. They need to be disciplined by particular skills from other people, or by other people who are equally undisciplined, like, but with a completely different point of view, like artists. And that's the point. You know, there's been a lot of talk over a very long period of time about artists and architects, what art and architecture is. And there are even groups that gather to talk about it. And it's all rubbish, because actually what it means is working together and not waiting to get that commission. It's about getting on and working with it and actually establishing a relationship, which creates questions, interesting questions, and one that you can work on your own, and also you can work on in the context of an architectural practice. And that feeds all the work all the time. And of course there are many people that find it difficult to come to us, particularly in the English context, and give us the project because of something you said in your introduction, which is they don't know what they're going to get. Oh, well, actually, we're saying that's why you should come to us, because you don't know what you're going to get. Clearly, there are some elements which are repeated, and I'm sure on the right-hand side you saw some things which come up in different projects. But they do have a lifespan, and they do disappear. Equally, you find that all your work is really the same work. So there are things which I remember thinking or trying to explore when I was a student here, in this room, which have a currency now. So what I was exploring perhaps in a very clumsy way in 1970, now you can see with this sort of very personal experience and longevity, that there are other ways of exploring these things, and everything has a currency. Therefore, the notion of chronology in architecture is a redundant notion in terms of the architect's work. Everything has a relevance. And you can bring all of that experience into a situation as long as you have a very open attitude, and therefore you have the structure within the office to deal with that. So, people like Hanif, he's not the only engineer we work with, he just happens to be sitting here, and I've got to be nice to him, which is not a problem at all. They are very important to the life of that office, so that you need to develop close relationships with other consultants that understand, that you get to the point where you say, and they know what you mean. You haven't said anything, but they know that it's sort of, this is either extremely difficult, or you might do a bit of this, or it might be one of those. And of course, if it is one of those, then you reckon, once you've drawn it, you say, well, actually, that's not what I mean. We don't want to do that. So it goes on in that way, and it's not very structured in that sense. We always hit, we never miss a deadline.
Are there any questions?
There's one over there, lady with the red hat.
Can you wait maybe until you get the microphone so people in this room can hear you?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I wanted to say, first of all, that I really admire the building on the Cardiff waterfront, which is the first time I ever stood in one of your buildings, and enjoyed it immensely. In a situation where you're actually working with a developer, for example, in the Twickenham Riverside project, how much of the involvement is yourself, and how much of it is the developer?
You want me to be specific about Twickenham Riverside?
Oh, I'd love you to, yes.
I'm very happy to do so. And that at the moment, that's a very good example of that particular project, and you'll notice that it was absent in all the slides that I showed tonight. It seemed to me that the problem with Twickenham is that it's a fantastic site which has been investigated by actually ourselves as well as other architects over many number of years, and nothing has ever happened there. But it's taken on the status as a project opportunity. Clearly, there's a defunct swimming pool, there's a very pleasant and interesting edge to the city, there's Ile Play Island opposite, and it's a wonderful place to be, although actually in its current state it's not a wonderful place, it's not as wonderful as it should be. But because it's sort of acquired the status of being a difficult site, it's very difficult to bring the local authority into a position where they can agree on anything. So that was originally a competition which we won. So Roger Zgolovich and myself worked on that project, and we won the project, which is great. Almost without exception, in the development of that project, I've had nothing to do with it, because there was no point in having anything to do with it until an agreed volume
of building was there was really developed through negotiation and conversation with the local authority, who are very difficult, and also because we don't want to waste our time in that particular instance. There was nothing that we could contribute as architects to that debate, because it's a debate that is sort of studded with pitfalls which are political, financial, all of those things. And Roger's much better at that than me. We're now, though, at the state where there is an agreed program of quantity that we can now, and so we're just beginning to pick it up again after 2 years or so, to begin to work with it again. I hope that answers your question, but that's where we are.
It does. Thank you very much.
Can you maybe pass the microphone to the
I live in Richmond. My memory of the Twickenham site was that a plan was put forward to presumably the council's brief, and there was massive, and then there was a consultation, process of consultation, and there was massive opposition on the part of the local people. And there's been a series of consultations between working groups and the council. Those consultations are not yet finished. They're supposed to go public, I believe, sometime next month. But there are large numbers of question marks still remaining. I spoke 2 or 3 evenings ago to one of the chaps on one of the working groups, and that's what he told me. Thank you.
Is that a question?
It's not a question, it's just a comment, sir.
Fair enough.
Put what you said into context.
I think, though, it's a very interesting context, because it's exactly the sort of public consultation where I don't want to align myself with the idea of being community architect, because it's not the context in which I wish to work, because it's become so complicated now that there's nothing that, as I said before, that we can contribute until things become clear and things are agreed, because it's all to do with politics and local interest groups, and it's not about the idea of realizing a real opportunity. It's all become a very negative debate, as far as I can see, from every side, which I don't want to be a part of a negative debate. It's our job to turn that into a positive debate when things become clear.
maybe pass the microphone there to the other lady.
I'm actually wanting to go back a little bit to your design process, and having now seen 2 of your relatively current projects and the process that you go through for them, and at the same time seeing some finished works and elements which have come through in terms of ideas or shapes or whatever colors into your current project. I'm wondering how, from when you first started your practice, how your processes have changed of working, whether you were always taking or had the liberty to take this much time, or how you actually managed to first get your works to be seen or to be built. So what are the major elements that you think have developed or transformed in the way that you work as a practitioner, as an architect?
I wonder that myself, well. I started the practice at 9:30 in the morning on August 20th, 1979. And a date is clearly etched into my brain. We're coming up to my 21st birthday next year. So I wish that we'll have a party to which you're all invited, of course. But I had one project, which was Riverside Studios. I had enough money which would, where I could see 6 months ahead to start that project. I didn't have anything else to do apart from some teaching commitments. And therefore, I spent an inordinate amount of time thinking and working on that project. At that time, working very closely with an artist called Gareth Jones, and then 1 or 2 other people, and then the project seemed to gather momentum. And so, I suppose I put more time and effort into that project, most of which never came to anything, over what turned out eventually to be a 2.5, 3-year period. But in the meantime, of course, a little bit of good fortune, a bit of hard work, the odd competition win, and these are things that
actually allowed one to grow. And I did have, the essential thing is, you had a point on the Earth's surface which was called an office, and it had a phone, and people answered the phone. That was critical. You can't do it if you're not there. In other words, you have to devote time to it, to put the effort into it in order to start a practice. On the other hand, I have to say that I am appalled in 1999 that so many young architects want to start their own practice. I don't understand it. Why would you want to do that? You know, it's because there's a completely different currency in architecture and architectural criticism, architectural response, which is related to the built project. The built project in 1968 was the last thing we wanted. What was much more interesting was the ideas, possibilities behind the project. And of course, there were some important magazines like Architectural Design, where virtually the whole issues at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, was devoted to ideas. And certainly as a student, you couldn't wait for that magazine to arrive through your door the last Friday of the month or whenever it was, because it was very interesting, had a currency. Because if you look through the pages of the sort of weekly magazines here, they're almost virtually devoted to build projects or projects which are going to happen more than likely. I find that very odd. I find it also happens to go with the idea amongst our journalists, and they have to take responsibility in the magazines, that they think that they are very important magazines that belong in Fleet Street. They have the concept of the scoop. Now, architecture doesn't lend itself readily to that sort of notion. It's not a sort of news item. It's a phenomenon within itself. And as Moyson has pointed out, many buildings take a long time to go from initial inquiry through to fruition. And sometimes they're abandoned, and most of the buildings that you begin to work on are never built at all. Of course, it doesn't. But you might discover something very important that is worth talking about. Most of the magazines in this country will not actually publish anything that is unbuilt. That's one thing. And assuming that you build something, most of the magazines like to be first to publish it. And if they're not first, they don't publish it at all. You know, that's a bit odd. As though, we've missed that scoop. You know, the fact that, for example, next year we'd finish the Cardiff Bay barrage. I started that project in 1989 and finished it in the year 2000. It's 11 years of your life working away, not only my life, but lots of other people's lives. I have no doubt at all that our IBA journal would be ringing me up and getting upset with me when I say that I don't want to commit myself to the IBA journal per se. Because the other thing that happens, if you send all the stuff to all the journals at exactly the same time, then no one publishes it at all. Very peculiar, very petty, and is not doing any of us in this room any service whatsoever. And the only way you can demonstrate your distaste of that is actually not to read anything like that. I didn't really answer your question, but I got carried away.
Can you explain a little bit about why you think there's been a certain, well, obviously you've been given an award in Russia, and what do you think the reason might be for that, why they appreciate your architecture perhaps more than elsewhere? Is there perhaps sort of a link to certain phase in their architectural history, certain idealistic projects, constructivist period, or, I don't know, I'm interested in what you think may be the reason for that appreciation.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is if I'd built that building in London, I wouldn't have got an award. Okay, so Russia is in a very difficult position at the moment. I should really more accurately say Moscow, because I don't think about the rest of Russia or anything about Moscow. And I find Moscow as a phenomenon in itself very interesting, because there you can observe a large city of 12 million people or so changing in a very short period of time. If you live in London, although London does change, it changes much more slowly, and we don't recognise it. So that's interesting, that the very fundamental elements of life, like economics, social values, education, all of these things are being tested on every front, every day. And there's a response to that. And I think that's very interesting for us to observe. So I was saying, having a conversation with Moisen before we came down here, that in fact the project for us is Moscow itself, not individual projects per se. It's a way of learning about large cities that are in some form of crisis or some form of opportunity. Therefore, you have to look at the building for which we got an award in that context, really. So that's more important than the architecture in itself. You also have a very limited palette of materials that you can use, and very limited budgets in which you can work. However, within the constraint, and I'm trying to answer your question, I think that we actually stretch that budget, local skills, and all those levels to a level where we manage to squeeze more out of it and more opportunity than others might have done. I don't want to touch the sort of ideological bit because there is an aspect of that, but I haven't that sort of out in my mind.
No, that is the RIBA Journal. I take the RIBA.
Hi, I'm Vicky Richardson. I'm the Deputy Editor of RIBA Journal. I'm very glad that I'm here. I'm very glad to hear what you said about architectural magazines. I enjoyed the talk, but I just kind of wanted to point out that I think if people are generally interested in the architectural press, I think it's part of our whole culture of architecture, and I think that it's worth pointing out that as magazines we're very much dependent on architects to come up with the kind of ideas that can generate interesting debate and kind of broader stream of consciousness in the press. So we're not a separate world from your world. I think the other thing is that as an architect you're obviously very much interested in the new and as you say, not being part of kind of current fashions or polite modernism. And as journalists, we're very much interested in the new as well, and in showing you, the readers, the things for the first time, so that when you open a magazine, it's not something that you've seen in 3 other magazines in the week before. So I just wanted to point out that's our interest in the scoop, and I think if we didn't have the scoop, nobody would bother reading a magazine. So I've made a note not to call you about the Cardiff barrage next year. But I hope that you will respect our interest in the new as much as we respect your interest in showing us things that are brand new.
I have great respect for you, my dear, and those aspirations. But I can't help but feel that you are wrong, and therefore I'd ask you to respect that position, because there are not that many magazines, 5 or 6, which you might have, of this sort of British persuasion. There are, in most projects, 5 or 6 completely different stories you can tell about a project. Just because the Architect's Journal might have done something, it doesn't cover every aspect of that project. Projects are very large things with lots of different people involved. It's not just a question of looking at something, it's about telling many different stories. And I think that's where the architectural press in this country is not serving its readership, which many are in this room tonight, because you don't get the other part of the story. You get whoever does it first, you get their version of it, and then nobody else does it. So you don't get any other version or any other point of view. So that's what's missing, is that rich, we'd like to see you, the RIBA Journal, arguing for the BA Journal, if you like, saying, oh, that rubbish, of course it's not like that, it's like this. Or the builder has extraordinary difficulties in building this sort of curve thing here. What was the story behind that? Or the client is whatever, so that it has noticeably become more news-orientated and trying to deal with a subject which is not news-orientated, in my view. And I'm sure that there are many people in this room who subscribe or get sent to a variety of magazines, and they're not thinking in terms of whether you cover cover these things first or not, because they might not, A, they might not see the other magazines, and B, even if they do, they're looking to see what you might have to say about it as the RIBA journal in your particular case. I don't see anything wrong with that. It seems to me quite normal and natural, and that's what should happen. Just because The Guardian covers recent statements by Tony Blair doesn't mean to say that the Times doesn't cover them, does it? Oh, it's a nonsense. Life isn't like that. Please get real. I'm talking on behalf of an awful lot of architects. It's not my view alone that I'm putting forward here. It's the view of, I'd like to say hundreds of architects. I haven't seen hundreds of architects, but it's a constant moan that I hear from architects, and we're all fed up with it. And there will come the point where none of us will send anything to anyone. Why should we? Just debate it. Work it out between you. Because we don't know how to behave. We're very confused.
I think I also caught a glimpse of Bruce back there. It'd be great if he had any there. Is he hiding? I thought maybe he had some observations or something. Are you there, Bruce? Or would you like to, it'd be great if you have any observations or thoughts on, especially maybe the question of process, since you and Will have been collaborating on so many different projects from different perspectives, working together on the painting. Is there something you'd like to say? But he was saying that he's always different and you're the one who Thank you. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.